Hi guys, Olive here today with some more fiction and nonfiction matchups. This is a tradition that I have been doing almost since the start of my channel, and I've been doing it in my own reading life even longer than that. What I like to do is find a fiction book and a nonfiction book that are in some way connected, and I read them either at the exact same time or around the same time, and I find that by doing this, I get so much more out of both of those books. So for example, if you're reading a classic work of literature, you could pair that up with a biography of its author. You could read a work of historical fiction and then pair that with a work of history that discusses either the time period in which that novel is set, or maybe it discusses the characters that novel highlights. The idea is that you're looking for some kind of a link between those two books that gives you a reason to couple them up. I started doing this for fun, but I kept doing it because I found that it was such a great way to enhance my reading experience overall. Learning about the same topic in two different places really reinforced my understanding of said topic. It also made both books that much more memorable. I found that I was retaining so much more of what I was reading. It makes characters come to life. It makes storylines more understandable. I think when you find a good pair, it can make reading even more fulfilling. The only problem with this strategy that I can think of is that finding a good pair can be really hard. Before you've read these books, how do you know which two to put together? How do you know that they're going to make a good pair? Sure, you can make an educated guess, and that very well may work out for you, but you could also end up with a flop. And that's the reason why for many, many years now, I've been making these types of videos in which I suggest fiction and nonfiction pairs that are tried and true, that I think work perfectly together so that you can dive in and know that you are in for a hopefully very enriching reading experience. And in this video, I have the latest crop of fiction and nonfiction matchup suggestions. We will start with a classic pairing and one that includes what was my favorite novel of last year, Eleanor of Avignon by Elizabeth de Lazier. This is a work of historical fiction that stars a young medicine woman who stumbles into the opportunity to become the apprentice to the private physician of the Pope, and then later on she helps to battle against an invisible, insidious enemy, the Black Death. I said before that this is a classic pairing because not only do I think you should read this book immediately, even, it is that good, but I think you should read it alongside a work that this author consulted as part of her research as she was writing this novel, and that's The Great Mortality by John Kelly. You can probably already guess that this is a history of the disease, the Black Death, the bubonic plague. It's everything we currently know about it, where it likely originated, how it swept across Europe, what it does to the human body, the massive toll it took overall. Should you choose to read these two at the same time, you will see some familiar faces. That is always fun, including a bad girl queen who was so fun to read about in both of these books, but I think you will be very impressed by how much truth is present in the novel, even though it's a work of fiction. I mean, the main character is fictional, but much about her world is not. And I think you will have the potential to be even more immersed in that world than I was, having read these two almost a year apart. If I could go back and do it all over, I would read these two together, because the misery of those years howls off the page of the history book. I think it makes it all the more clear what young Eleanor would have been up against. If you want to hear even more about this novel, I did go on about it at length in a video I made late last year in which I discussed all my favorite novels of the year. I will link that for you below and up in the cards. The next pair I'm going to talk about is based a lot more on vibes, but hear me out. Around New Year's Day this year, I read a thriller called The Hunting Party by Lucy Foley. And this is about a group of old college friends who decide to rent a remote cabin in the woods together as part of a long-standing tradition they have to go on trips together. Except this time, someone ends up dead. Not long before I read it, though, I had read this really interesting, very unique nonfiction book called The Age of Deer by Erica Hauser, which is both a natural and cultural history of the deer in North America. It discusses everything from the myriad meanings that deer held for native peoples, all the different ways they found to use the body of the deer beyond just for sustenance. It discusses many other topics, but then it brings us up to the modern day, in which we are still trying to figure out the place that deer have in our lives, in our neighborhoods, as the reach of humans moves further and further into their spaces. It's not a flawless match for The Hunting Party. Its focus is on North America when the novel is set in the Scottish Highlands. But the characters in the novel do go deer hunting, which is a topic that's, of course, covered in the nonfiction book, and it's a lot more of a universal topic. But it's really the sense of quiet that both of these books had that made me feel like they would make a good pair. I read them about a month apart in time, so that's something I noticed that they both possessed. It's kind of an accidental pairing. Of course, the sense of stillness that The Hunting Party evokes is a lot more eerie, it being a thriller and all, when The Age of Deer makes you feel this sense of peace and reverence almost. But they do have that deer element in common, and I think they both make stellar winter reads. So although the connection between these two is a little looser, this is a pairing I can recommend. The next duo also has a wildlife connection. A few years back, I read a fantastic nonfiction book called A Wing and a Prayer by Anders and Beverly Gyllenhaal. And this book tells a handful of stories all about different birds who are facing, at the very least, hardships, at the very worst, potential extinction, all largely because of human actions, but also how some do-gooders are stepping in to try to help them survive. One of the birds mentioned in this book is the famously rare ivory-billed woodpecker. It's almost a creature of myth at this point because no one is certain that this bird still exists. Purported sightings of it gain a ton of interest in both the scientific and the birding communities. The whole controversy surrounding the existence of this bird is discussed very early on in this nonfiction book, and I would recommend you read at the very least that initial section before picking up the novel The Life List of Adrian Mandrick by Chris White. This is a contemporary novel starring an anesthesiologist who moonlights as a competitive bird watcher. I like to refer to him as Don Draper if he really liked birds, because this man has a lot of baggage, most of which seems to stem from his very dysfunctional parents. We get a lot of flashback scenes to his earlier life, to his very troubled upbringing. And one of those flashback scenes is very important because we see him take a bird watching excursion with his mother, during which she swears she sees an ivory bill. But Adrian is never sure if that's actually what she saw. And he has to question the legitimacy of what they saw together in his adult life because, as a competitive bird watcher, he wants to include that bird on his life list, which is the total list of birds that a single person has seen throughout their lifetime. And this matters to him because he wants to move up the ranks of North American birders. And he doesn't know if he can include the ivory-billed woodpecker, which is the holy grail. The mystery surrounding this elusive bird seems to symbolize the confusion that adult Adrian still has about what exactly happened during his childhood. So if you read more about this bird that serves as a symbol in his life through reading the nonfiction book, I think, in my personal opinion, it has the potential to really beef up the story in the contemporary novel. Plus, it's not just that one bird that has Adrian's interest. He has almost 900 of them on his life list. So I think by reading a book about birds alongside the novel, you can really start to understand his sometimes toxic enthusiasm for birds, especially since these two authors do just a tremendous job in making you feel invested in the outcomes of each and every bird they discuss. Going back to humans, though, I think this next pair could also be helpful in forming a deeper understanding for the characters, because not too long ago, I finally got around to reading Long Bright River by Liz Moore, which is a thriller set in Philadelphia. It stars a cop who is desperately on the hunt for any trace of her drug-addicted sister because she's gone missing as a serial killer is on the loose. And I think for those of us who have never struggled with addiction ourselves, I think it's easy to misunderstand what it's like to go through that. And that's something that I felt like I got a lot more after reading Dope Sick by Beth Macy, which is a kind of expose that discusses the impacts of the opioid crisis on rural communities in Virginia. In Dope Sick, Beth Macy talks about why the opioid crisis has happened, why people are getting hooked on opiates. And a large number of those people who found themselves addicted were originally prescribed an opiate, probably for pain, but they weren't informed just how addictive these drugs are. And so completely unknowingly, some of them found themselves addicted to opiates. And then when they ran out of options to legally get their fix, or their doctors cut them off because it was clear they were addicted to these pills, they turned to the closest available alternative on the street, another opium derivative, heroin. There is so much stigma and shame surrounding addiction in our society. I think it's really easy for those of us who've never gone through it to pass judgment. Of course, we can say, just get clean, just get off drugs, because it sounds that easy. It sounds that simple. But if you give this book a read, I think you will start to understand. It starts to clear away some of the fog. It talks about how easy it is to get addicted, but how hard it is to get off of drugs. Talks about what it's like to go into withdrawal, what's known as getting dope sick, because going through that can kill you. It can feel impossible to get clean. So although the novel and the nonfiction book come from different worlds setting-wise, the novel taking place in a more urban area versus more rural communities being discussed in the nonfiction book, the suffering is the same. And I think if you read these closely together in time, you will find yourself with heaps more compassion for the main character's sister. We're going to move on from thrillers in this last pairing because although I don't discuss science fiction or horror very much on this channel at all, I did read a book recently that contained both of those elements. It's a translated novel called Pink Slime by Fernanda Trias. It is set in this dystopia in which the world has been turned upside down by toxic algal blooms. It's poisoned the water, killed all the fish, made any sort of moisture in the air noxious to breathe. It has completely changed the way that people live their lives. Our unnamed protagonist is working as a caretaker for a special needs child, and she's taking care of him, trying to keep both of them alive long enough as she earns the money to buy her and her mother's way out of the country. I think if you don't know much about algae, even just the idea that this villainous algal bloom could strangle an entire region and change the way they all live their lives might sound to you a bit far-fetched, but I assure you, you will understand if you read The Devil's Element by Dan Egan, which is a history of the element phosphorus. And the reason why it's relevant here is that an overabundance of phosphorus in a body of water can cause an explosion of algae, which can choke out every other life form in a body of water, make it poisonous for basically any other life form, including humans. Think I'm kidding? This author starts with an anecdote about a man who jumped into a polluted canal as he was running from the cops, and that guy nearly died. It's no joke. Now, this nonfiction book does talk about a lot more than just algae. It is a deep dive into phosphorus, after all. A deep dive that won't kill you, fortunately. But I think even after you've read the algae information that will tie it to Pink Slime, you'll want to keep reading because this book is dynamite. So much fabulous information in such a small package. I'm still astonished how much he managed to fit in here, given how short of a nonfiction book this is. This was one of my favorites of last year for a reason. And then there's the color combination of these two colors. I mean, the opposites on the color wheel draws in the eye. It's just delicious. Don't eat it though. So that was my latest batch of fiction and nonfiction pairing suggestions. I do hope you'll consider giving some of these a try. Let me know if you do. I'd love to hear what you think. I have listed and linked all of the books I discussed today in the description box below if you want to check these out. And if you want even more of these types of suggestions, cards. If you're new to my channel, or if you want to go back and revisit the videos I've made in the past, I have made a playlist that houses all the videos I've made like this one, and I will link that playlist for you in the description box and up in the cards. And at the very bottom of that exact same description box, you will also see links to everywhere you can find me around the internets. So my Goodreads, Storygraph, Instagram, all the places I'm the most active, in case you want to keep up with what I am reading and doing right now. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day. I'll catch you in the next video. Bye.